Well, hi, folks, and welcome to another episode of Insights with NetSupport. For this session, I am really excited. Got somebody who I sense is a very like-minded individual, Brian Aspinall, all the way from sunny Canada. Brian, welcome to the show.
It's the middle of summer here. Thanks for having me.
You are very, very welcome. I'm looking forward to chatting with you. I did try and condense your bio into a paragraph, and I'm going to apologize in advance because there was way too much to squeeze in.
My
But
mom wrote it.
But for those listening who haven't come across you, Brian, particularly UK side, the best summary I could come up with is educator, 3 times TEDx speaker, coder, consultant, worked with ministries, universities, districts, and school teams, internationally recognized thought leader in digital skills, one of the brightest STEM innovators in Canadian education, and frankly, someone who's right up my street for a healthy conversation. So I hope that encapsulates.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
Fantastic. Well, listen, I'm looking forward to chatting with you. There's lots of topics that are very current, and I'm really interested to get your take and insights on it. I'm going to start with the easy one because it's not hard to know that you are most definitely a STEM guy. And so I'm really interested about your vision of technology and education, and some of the things that you see as the sort of shining moments or opportunities right now. I know AI is going to crop up in our conversation, but tell us where you see things right now.
You know, isn't that funny? 6 months ago, we weren't talking about AI. Now, if you're not talking about AI, you live under a rock. You know, having been in this now in the education world for just over 2 decades, I'm starting to see what I was always told. Everything's a pendulum. Everything's a pendulum. So I'm starting to experience the narrative of coming back, if you will. So the Coles Notes, we call it Coles Notes in Canada, Cliff Notes in the United States. Computer science was my undergrad because the Y2K bug inspired me in the 90s. So that's how I ended up in computer science. Now, without talking about AI, I do want to talk about something that I think we're overlooking currently right now with regards to this pendulum swing, if you will. I think back to, let's just pick on the 70s, the 80s, and maybe even the 90s. There was a big push for hardware. The cost of the PC came down, from 10 grand to like $3,500. So we started seeing personal computing in everybody's house. It was kind of the hardware era, as I like to describe it. And of course, we immediately saw the software era follow suit. We saw the productivity suite, all things Microsoft Office, Publisher 98, WordPerfect, all those things, which then I think forced us back into a bit of a hardware side with the evolution of mobile computing and Steve Jobs and tablets and all those other things, which then forced us back onto the software side as we see app stores and apps, and Angry Birds was a big thing, 15, 20 years ago. The point of my story here is what we're overlooking is the Internet of Things. And I think the Internet of Things is the current decade, the next, the future, the current, the present iteration of what's going on. And it's sort of being overshadowed now, overlooked. I think the narrative, at least in schools, for the push for coding, I mean, it's still very hot, but that's sort of the last 5 or so years. And now that we're there, let's go back to the hardware side. We forget in computer science. We just think coding and computer science are synonymous, and we forget about the hardware side. Drives me batty, drives me insane. So I think there's an opportunity right now to discuss making makerspace, STEM, project-based learning by really jumping on the Internet of Things and looking at some of these small devices that we have access to in our schools and our classrooms.
I love that. I mean, you resonate with me first and foremost because I remember many years ago getting my magazine on a Saturday morning and copying the lines of code out onto my PC, saving to an audio cassette and hoping it would load the next day. And we've seen a big growth, certainly in the UK, in terms of makerspace activities, programmable bots, microbits, robots. I was talking across in Dubai at the Guest Conference, which is the sort of Middle Eastern tech conference. And there was a big focus there on not just the metaverse, but Web 3.0 and unlocking technologies that really align with STEM and how, I guess, probably aligning with your view, Brian, a lot of this is about skills, not just acquisition of knowledge as well, isn't it?
For me, it's 100% skills. Dating back to, okay, so boy, we could talk for hours, I think, you and I. Once upon a time, I had to interview to get into my university program. And I say that because we have this narrative in school that the purpose of school is to prepare kids for more school. And I'm a big advocate for dropping the grading narrative, at least in primary school and primary education, because of my experiences here in Canada in the K-8 space. The reason I say all this stuff is because I interviewed to get into my university program, and that was 25 years ago. Granted, my grades got me the interview, but my skills that made me pass the interview got me into the program. I share that because we stand behind the grading narrative as the reason that grades still exist for, at least here, the post-secondary conversation. Now, I think that the shift from content acquisition to what we actually do with that has been happening, at least with how we instruct our lessons. I think that we've really shifted in the last 2, 3, 4 decades how we teach, but we haven't touched a damn thing with how we evaluate, at least not here, at least not in the part of the United States that I've been to. We haven't touched anything. And so we've shifted, changed everything but the grading narrative, and myself included, so guilty of saying, I need a math mark. I need a math mark. I got to fill a mark book. The mark book police have never come to my classroom, but I'm guilty of saying this. And that always meant I'm doing a Friday afternoon quiz because it's fast. I can hammer out a bunch of grades. I can plug that hole and fill my mark book. But the reality is, not once am I sitting here looking at the needs of my students. I'm looking at my needs. I'm looking at my fears. I'm afraid of my administrator asking me for my mark book and finding a big old hole and all the other things. So we continue to let evaluation drive instruction in the sense that I need a blank mark. Therefore, I'm doing a quick task. And there's not a lot of rich opportunity for critical thinking in some of those tasks, as you know. And also, what are we really measuring with that one-off type of assessment? So I say those things because I have always been a big advocate for focusing on skills over content knowledge. And I'm not suggesting that content knowledge isn't important. If my grade 8 students are going to find the volume of a the volume of a cylinder, they need to know their multiplication tables. But I don't necessarily need to evaluate their ability to memorize all of their multiplication tables. There's a big disconnect there. There's a big fallout there. I like to pick on spelling tests as an example. I'm not against spelling tests, but if we're going to give a kid 50 words and say 12 are going to be on tomorrow's test to go memorize them, meh. We're going to give kids words they've never seen before and say, can you try and spell these based on what you know, rhyming, conventions, all the other skills, and then they can do their best to try and spell words they've never spelled before. That's a much better form of assessment, in my humble opinion. So I think we have a lot of work to do on the evaluation side, which would help push this conversation into more of a focus on skills and less on rote memorization.
Oh, Brian, you are a kindred spirit. I have been known to be quite critical of NAEP in the US and how we focus in on those ratings. And one thing that we're seeing on a global scale is we're all familiar with the PISA rankings and what are deemed high-performing school systems, albeit a very narrow measure. And there's a big piece of work by the OECD at the moment at revising that to look at a new measure, which is an education system for human flourishing, which is much more about developing, resilience, skills, critical thinking, a love of learning, all those things that often you can't measure quite so easily, but we know within schools are the things that we hold most dear. And I'm going to have to tie it back to technology because one of my roles is I chair an alternative provision academy, young people who struggle in mainstream education. And I've always said for some of those learners, if we gave them 2 hours chatting with Siri, Alexa, or any other tool to share their knowledge of a subject, they would excel compared to asking them to hold a pen and write down what they can remember. And as technology moves, that's got to be the green light to look at different ways to look more at the formative rather than the summative assessment and actually capture along a learning journey in a more accurate way.
I couldn't agree more. It's been my experience having studied computer science in my undergrad and so we teach to our strengths, right? I've been teaching coding in my classroom for 20 years. Admittedly, I grabbed my surfboard and jumped on that hour of code wave around 2010 because it was the hottest thing going. But it's bigger than that. You see, when kids learn to code, it never works the first time through. And immediately out the gate, that challenges us to redefine what it means to make a mistake and fail at school. So we have one context where we're forcing the narrative of teaching coding at school, and then the bell rings and we're giving kids a math quiz where they have to do 10 of the same questions, and mistakes are bad and failure is punished. Like, there's a massive disconnect in both of those places. It's also been my experience that students in my classroom with IEPs, individual education plans, accommodations, modifications, whatever the case, they excel in those worlds. They excel in the spaces that aren't focused solely on getting the correct answer, particularly in the era that we currently are living in now. I know we know ChatGPT is going to enter this conversation. And I'm aware that I can ask ChatGPT right now to create a lesson plan based on Ontario, Canada curriculum for any grade, and then write a report card comment, and it'll do it no problem. So it really gives me the freedom to leverage that to do the clerical stuff I'm supposed to do, but then focus on those rich opportunities in my classroom. Whenever I go and speak and do consulting work, I tell all these folks, listen, the further you go with STEM and project-based learning, the more time you're going to find yourself at the Keurig machine and not at the photocopier. Trust me. And I'm going to say both ends of this spectrum. Let's say the IEP spectrum. That is, I've got kids identified gifted, enrichment, bright as can be, who also need those classroom enrichment opportunities that the playground, the sandbox of STEM provides, that you're not going to get from a worksheet. I'm tired of seeing photocopied worksheets with smaller or bigger font, and we call it enrichment.
Well, listen, we are most definitely on the same wavelength. I think it will be hard to not deviate too far from AI on different strands. Sometimes to be critical of the fact that we perhaps have in a little bit of a sense of it's the panacea to everything. And as you've explained in your skills at getting your lesson plans put together, sometimes it highlights the fact the skill is in the questioning, the signposting. The more accurate and more descriptive you are in what you want to know, the better output you're going to get. So to me, that's another good evidence is those are the skills we also need to be teaching to our learners. The questioning, the challenge, the reasoning, and the validation of what comes out the other end.
I completely agree 100%. I think it's more, there's nothing wrong with the narrative of memorizing content, but I think the assessment then lies into formulating opinions around it, asking good questions, challenging it, collaborating around it, not just regurgitating it, back. And I think I could spend hours talking about ChatGPT. If you read any headline in any big national newspaper, the pushback against it of the narrative of cheating, and that needs to just friggin' stop immediately, because ChatGPT and cheating do not belong in the same conversation. And if the narrative of, we have to eliminate this technology because kids will cheat, well, that's telling us our assessment is the problem, not the technology.
Amen. Yeah, absolutely.
Has not evolved to meet the needs of our young people and the demands of what's happening. It drives me bonkers. I think the banning of anything is a horrible idea, but the banning of technology because of cheating, didn't we learn anything from COVID and lecture style learning? It's dead.
Yeah, it's hard to argue against that point, really, isn't it? Listen, we've talked about STEM to a high level, and we've had a little bit of a detour onto ChatGPT and AI and bits. One of the core bits, obviously, that you've done a huge amount of work on is around CodeBreaker. I'm really interested if you could share a little bit more about CodeBreaker and your vision for what you offer.
I love telling the origin story of CodeBreaker. Number one, it's my passion project. So as an educator, I still in my corporate life try to model the idea of following your dreams. I spend more money on it than, it makes, so to speak, because I just am driven to try and make it grow. It started by accident, admittedly. Being a computer science major, meaning we teach to our strengths, meaning my undergrad is made up of 85% math, I was always teaching through the lens of content creation. I'm going back 20 years to when I started in my elementary classroom. I was a grade 7, 8 teacher forever. And what happened was neighboring districts started tapping me on the shoulder and saying, listen, it takes 10 years to write curriculum. How are you doing this? What does coding look like in grade 6 social studies in Ontario, Canada? Can you come and have a conversation with our teachers? And I said, heck yeah. And it evolved and it morphed. And then it led to, larger tech conferences and speaking at big events. And I admit that I used coding as my foot in the door to have the bigger pedagogical conversations about evaluation, assessment, the really important conversation. Teaching coding is one thing, and that's great, but you're not ready for it if you're still marking worksheets. We'll just leave it there. So what happened is I started doing all kinds of consulting to the point where my ministry, my province reached out, a local university reached out, invited me to go to grad school. I never left. So I resigned from my elementary classroom. I stayed in higher ed where they celebrate innovation and want you to, push further. So the consulting fell into my lap. It just did. My government was like, okay, we got a guy who's been doing coding for 10 years since 2005, 2003 in his classroom. And we want to bring him on, not to create coding curriculum, but to create K-8 curriculum. To align coding tasks with existing curriculum. Number one, to show it's not a one-off. Number two, to show it can be integrated so that STEM doesn't become a standalone class. And number three, so we can really push the evaluation practices. Fast forward to 2019, 2020. All my consulting work, all my speaking went out the window. On March 12th, 2020, I was in Grand Rapids, Michigan, about 2 hours from here. I was the scheduled Friday the 13th morning keynote speaker at McCall, the Michigan Association of Computer Users and Learning statewide conference. That didn't happen. March 12th, 2020 is when the NBA shut down. I got an email that said they're closing the borders, get your Canadian butt back home and get out of the United States. And all the consulting went out the window. Now, I had already published 2 books at that point in time. And I thought, what the heck am I going to do during this pandemic? I'd already resigned from my classroom. I was teaching higher ed. Higher ed doesn't pay the bills, by the way. It's more fun to me, but it doesn't pay the bills at all. So I had a bit of a dilemma sitting around in 2020 going, what in the heck am I going to do? I'm not doing any consulting work, at least I didn't know virtual was going to come. We didn't know that. Didn't know.
No.
So what happened was I had thought, you know what? I've grown 100,000 followers on social media as a result of sharing my computer science lessons back in the day. Maybe this is an opportunity to pivot. Maybe this is an opportunity to model what I preach in my classroom, to show how we follow passion projects in our adult life. So I reached back to school leaders and district leaders all across North America and beyond and said, listen, we're all at home indefinitely for at least the next 6 months. I've written 2 books. I've been through the process. I am starting a publishing company because now my new mission is to start telling the stories that need to be heard. I want to tell the stories of the really innovative things happening in Osage, Iowa, population 1,700, but one of the leading districts for the state of Iowa in terms of computer science education. I want to tell that story, leveraging my social media as the megaphone to, shout from the rooftops. So tapped on doors, knocked doors, sent emails, and reached out to school district leaders I'd met over the years and said, I think you should write a book. I think you should tell a story. And that was sort of the evolution of CodeBreaker during the pandemic, was to really become a powerhouse and also to disrupt professional development, because we knew it was going to change coming on the other end of 2020. How can we now put together a group of, I call us misfits, all the people I want to hang out with in the staff room, not my old elementary staff room, these people. How do we put together a group of individuals that are all doing amazing things with, a common goal in their own lane, in their own right, and then really share it with the world? Back to today, the consulting, of course, has come back in full force, if not more so, especially with ChatGPT. And it actually has really allowed our greater team the opportunity to share their work on some national and some international scales, which I'm really, really, really proud of. So somebody described us, we've been described as a Canadian movement a few times this year. Somebody said we are a beautiful invitation to a beautiful invitation to reflect on education, a dangerous invitation to reflect on education, which I kind of like. I kind of like how that sounds. So we wanted to move from the content area of CodeBreaker being just solely, coding PD to the narrative of leadership. And breaking code is the narrative of disruption and change. And it's more than physically programming a computer, but that's still included.
You're talking about those bits there. You remind me of. I'm quite a big fan of people like Clayton Christensen and some of the work that he kind of documented on digital disruption. But it always takes that passionate voice to take that segue and say, don't think of something in its silo, but think about how that breaks out into the bigger picture. I just wish you'd come across a bit more enthusiastic, Brian. That's all.
Me?
That's my British sarcasm, because I can see how it really kind of that passion that drives you on that one there.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, talking of passions, one thing that something I'm very passionate about is about our education system adapting to be relevant and appropriate for job-ready skills. I mean, some of this aligns with our earlier conversation. And I know from reading some of your notes, you're a big proponent of portfolios. And I'm kind of interested to unpick your thoughts on that, because, my view has always been that in the UK education system, we used to have a much broader sets of pathways for our learners. And in many of the curriculum subjects, they allowed the teachers cite the continued assessment to lead towards their ultimate academic outcome. And in many ways, we've narrowed the focus back to the traditional wait till the end of the 3-year window and sit 2-hour exams. Mm-hmm. And it always conflates with me, because once you get to university, those qualifications that really matter, we're quite happy assessing and grading you over a 3-year period in chunks, rather than putting all the weighting on an exam. And yet somehow for 16 and 18-year-olds, that's not deemed appropriate. So I'm interested in your views around portfolios. We've touched a little bit, I think, on a fairer way to actually measure success.
I'll speak through my lens, and that's 15 years in an elementary classroom in grades 7, 8. Here in Ontario, Canada, we do standardized testing in grade 6 and standardized testing in grade 9. So the best place to be is 7, 8, because they leave you alone. My administrators are always like, hey, keep the 14-year-olds out of the office. Everybody's happy. That's the goal. Get them to school and keep them out of the office, okay? Now, having said that, we have a program here called, I'm glad you said the word pathways. We have a program called Creating Pathways to Success here in Ontario, Canada, and it focuses on portfolio building. And the idea is that we start to create portfolios the second our 5-year-olds enter a school building. And that portfolio of learning is, in theory, supposed to follow them through 12th grade, grade 12 here. So that's, 20 years. They're 15 years to 18 years of age, 13, 14 years for these kids. So from my lens in 7, 8, I don't care about standardized testing because it's not something I worry about. I don't have to teach to that test. I don't prepare kids for that narrative. I don't even care about that thing. The less we talked about standardized testing at my former school, the better our scores got. The less grades we put on work, the better our data got. And a lot of it was because we removed the fear. There's a lot to unpack here. I spent 4 years in a gradeless school, and the narrative from that first year became, in the first year, it was always, what did I get? What did I get? What did I get? In year 4, it became, can I try this? Can I try this? Can I try this? And when you look at the evolution over the course of the 4 years, we removed the fear. Whether you get good grades or not, you're driven by them in some capacity. Every kid has to admit this. If you're a C student, and I use the air quotes to avoid the label, then you already think that you're going to get a C on the next assignment, and that's going to dictate the level of effort you're going to put into it. So we thought, if we can remove grades from this conversation, then maybe we will improve student outcomes. Well, that forced us to look at portfolios almost accidentally. It wasn't like I was like, I'm coming in, we're doing portfolios, we're ditching grades. It morphed into that evolution because I was using, well, admittedly, Scratch. Scratch became my portfolio of kids doing math with code. And I was sharing that work on Google Classroom. And because Scratch content is embeddable, all of a sudden every student had a website with every Scratch app they'd made over the course of a couple of years. And it happened by accident. The real metric, though, was the significant, massive improvement in our standardized testing scores, the less we focused on it. And it really boiled down to rapport, culture, climate, engagement. Pre-COVID, not many of my 7 and 8s were coming to school on snow days when I started teaching. But by 2013, 2014, they all were. And my principal was like, what's going on? And I said, I don't know. They're 14 and they want to be at school for some goofy reason on a snow day. Prior to COVID, before the virtual learning days, I remember saying to them, like, why are you here? It's a content day. Everything's on Google Classroom. And they were like, FOMO. And that's when you know you've won. When a kid says FOMO to come to school on a snow day at 14 years of age, you know you're doing something right. So that really focused the school, the area schools, and the high school that we all fed to reevaluate our own evaluation. What happened was our feeder schools started to go gradeless, and so did our grade 9s at some of the high schools, because they saw what we were doing. Over the course of 5 years, from us going gradeless, or starting that process, to being like fully into it, the parents are finally on board. That was another learning curve too. Parents need to know math marks. Everything. Math is a quantity of correct answers, and it's scored like golf. I need to know this. That's what our parents think. Anyway, what happened was we started to see our high school leaders come back, 12th grade students, grade 12 students come back to do the recruiting for our 8th graders, our grade 8s, to choose that high school. And I said to the guidance counselor, did you do this on purpose? Those are all our former students. And she said, I have no idea what elementary school they're from. They've been in high school for 4 years now. I don't know where they're from. And I said, well, they're all ours. And the correlation from the high school was the students that our elementary school sent into grade 9 were so focused on trying new things, taking risks, and being independent problem solvers that they didn't care about grades. They didn't really, it was almost problematic that they didn't really care about tasks they were being assigned, because they were making them so personal anyway. They were tweaking them because that's what they were taught in grade 8. But kids that were coming from our other elementary schools down the road, who are used to a more of a spoon-fed, regurgitated system, well, if an iPad stopped working, they'd throw it, they'd sit for 75 minutes, go, I don't know, the iPad died, I didn't know what to do next. Like, it was always, I didn't know what to do. I'm used to a spoon-fed environment. Tell me what to do, and then I'm going to do it, and then you're going to give me the grade. Well, our kids weren't used to that, because we'd removed all of those hurdles. So now our kids are not only going, oh, your iPad's not working, let me pick it up and try and fix it for you. I'm going to code you an app while I'm at it. And it improved the entire community. I don't have any concrete, quantifiable data other than standardized testing, but all the anecdotal, the data around truancy, the fact that nobody was getting suspended, all that data, that as a byproduct to the process, told us that our approach to portfolios was genuinely working.
It sounds almost like, when you're wanting to teach coding, that actually the thing that isn't relevant is the technology, and it's all gasp, shock, horror about people and culture and the way that you actually deliver the learning journey. I wish some of our governments would actually recognize that as being the more important part of the measure.
100%. I think our 5-year-olds entering kindergarten, some of their most richest tasks are we call it unplugged coding, where you code your friend to move from point A to point B. But reality is that's actually location and movement in geometry. We've been teaching that forever. Okay. So there are ways to do what we've been doing without pulling in technology. And then we're focusing our kids on thinking skills. Our 10-year-olds struggle with using a trackpad. It's hard to get them on a Chromebook to do anything with a microbit. Like, the computer itself is a learning curve. And because we don't have computer science curriculum in grade 3, that's not what we're assessing. We're assessing the soft skills. We actually report on them in our report cards here on the front page, which I could also talk about forever, because I don't have to open my report card to see the grades. I can look at the assessment of the soft skills and know if you're an A student, if you're excellent in organization and collaboration and self-regulation. I don't need to open your report card to know you're pulling off A's in all your classes. So maybe if we just focused on those soft skills, like when parents come to me and say, I want little Johnny's math mark to improve, it doesn't mean more math. It means get yourself organized, lay things out, make a graphic organizer. It's not more math, it's our approach. So, I think that for many of us that doesn't need technology, which 10 years ago I never would have said in a million years.
Just one last point on that, Brian. I mean, one thing that also resonates with that approach is it would be hard to not assume that from that actually that approach is also much more inclusive across your learner cohort and abilities, because you're building that resilience and that self-reliance to learn through exploration rather than feeling that there's a constant judgment of your comparison with others.
That is it to a T. We have removed the narrative of standardization, especially in such a diverse country like mine in Canada, that some of these standardized questions are so bloody biased because they target like not broken home white kids. That is there's a lot of bias in our standardized testing. So yes, as I remove those kinds of obstacles, I create a classroom experience where everybody feels welcome. Everybody feels they have an opportunity to show some success, because that sandbox allows all kids to demonstrate their learning to the best of their ability, not being asked to come up to a standard or down to a standard, or me trying to push them to any standard. The best of their ability. And quite often when I provide those opportunities in those environments, they surpass my expectations, things I would never have seen from them in a more traditional type of assessment.
Love it. Love it. And I'm going to have to ask, in the UK, one of the things that often is fed back from the classroom really is that where we have standardized testing and there's an obligation at certain points, it almost feels that we're teaching to the test. Actually, you lose valuable learning time because of the time spent preparing for the testing process. Do you find that your approach actually allows much more time for the process of learning rather than validating?
100%, because what we've done too, and as an elementary school teacher, is blurred the lines between subject areas. I'm a homeroom teacher in 7 and 8. I have to teach every class. So that means 60 minutes of math, bell ring, 60 minutes of literacy, bell ring, 60 minutes of French, because we're Canadian, bell ring, 60 minutes of et cetera, et cetera. Now it's project-based learning. In my humble opinion, my kids are actually doing more than 60 minutes of math throughout the day. They're doing more than 60 minutes of literacy throughout the day. They're doing more than 60 minutes of French throughout the day, because it's all embedded within everything that they're doing, which has to drive the learning up, which has to then obviously drive the data up. I think it's very important for us to blur, and our high school friends have such an opportunity to do it, but because they're bigger, I'm not a high school teacher, so I won't speak to it because I'll offend somebody. But they're just bigger entities and they're divisional. So they have so much opportunity to do what we do in elementary, but it's not happening, which brings me back to the narrative of teaching kids for more school, because I was always told, you're a grade 8 teacher. How are you preparing kids for high school? Well, what does that mean? How are high schools preparing for our kids?
Absolutely. I'm conscious we've been chatting for about half an hour here, and we could probably talk for a few days. Apart from lessons with Mr. Aspinall, what do you think is exemplary about the Canadian education system?
Well, I've been really thinking about this question because I've only taught in this country, so it's hard for me to comment outside. But I will say the broad stroke. We love broad strokes, especially on Twitter about education. We got the one fix that'll fix everything across the globe. I constantly see the narrative about teachers needing to be paid more. And while I agree as a generalization that is a thing, Canadian educators get paid well, which means we invest a lot into our education system. So we pay our teachers a decent amount of money. We are very, very, very diverse. And I believe that innovation requires perspective, and perspective requires diversity. And because we're so inclusive in that regard, I really, truly believe it sets us apart. Now, excuse me, because we pay our teachers so well, there's not a lot of money left for professional development. So it's kind of a caveat.
Yeah, you can't have it always, I guess.
No, you can't.
And when we see recruitment and retention a challenge in many markets, certainly the UK struggling. One regard, of course, is always about pay with economic pressures. I think there's also the narrative of respect for the profession that perhaps when I think back to my youth as a student, teachers were highly respected in the community, and perhaps more recently, media find it's good news to try and be critical of educators rather than understanding the pressures and challenges. So I kind of feel that we need to move back to a direction of really respecting that this is the engine room of our future society and economy, and we need to perhaps embrace and support more.
You know, when we went gradeless, I was teaching at a school that was more affluent than some of the other schools in my district. And so a lot of the parents were very, very, very successful and highly educated. And that comes with a whole complex set of problems. Not problems, criteria. So we found our doctor and lawyer parents who are going, what do you mean there's no grades? I had grades. I got good grades. I went to med school. I need my kid to do the same. And it was like, we're sitting here scratching our head like, well, you don't practice medicine like you did 20 years ago. We're not lining up at your office to tell you what to do about medicine moving forward. Yet here you are doing it to us. And, you know, it's a big, important conversation. The reality is education is the one industry where 99% of the people on the planet have at least 16, 17, 18 years experience in it, which makes us all professionals on how to improve it. My concern, my issue is those broad strokes. There's far too many variables to paint broad strokes to do this one catch-all sort of fix, if you will. Now, having said all of those things, when I was a kid, I was taught if the teacher calls home, you're dead. When I started teaching, I found myself the victim, if you will, of parents bad-mouthing me on Facebook. And that threw me for a loop. I was in my first couple of years. I'm like, what is happening? What's going on? Not only are they doing this in a public forum, the kids are watching, my colleagues are watching. Like, what is happening? I wish there was more trust in the education space. I think that ultimately is what it boils down to. I'm trying to be mindful. I don't want to insult anybody, but with all industry, there's going to be a handful of people that suck. There's going to be a handful of people that are rock stars. And then that's why we sort of lead in the middle, teach to the middle, if you will. It's a common quote up here. I think we let the actions of a few blanket us all. And newspapers, they sell, and they're based on headlines, and everything is clickbait. That's the era. That's the world in which we live. And unfortunately, I wish we could go back, as you said. I don't quite know how. Maybe we need another generational turnover.
Well, you would at the beginning of this conversation, you did talk about the fact that we do tend to swing backwards and forwards in cycles on things, don't we? So maybe it's just like technology. But, you know, I led with respect and you ended with trust. And I think those are two pretty strong words to try and associate when we think about educators and the broader profession. Brian, genuinely, it's been a pleasure, just your enthusiasm and sharing your insights. For those listening in, how can they find out more about your work, your pretty impressive collection of musings and writings and books, as well as some of your activities like CodeBreaker?
I'm an open book. If you fire Brian Aspinall into that Google machine, you probably find out where I live and what I'm having for dinner.
So there you go. Go Google Brian and it will be worth your while. It's been a pleasure, sir. Enjoy the rest of the day. And thank you so much for coming on. I hope we can do it again.
Cheers. Thank you.